The doors of Stonebridge Academy swung open, and the first rays of morning sunlight breaks through the tall windows. Students filled the halls, their chatter echoing through the grand entrance. But amidst the noise, a newcomer stepped through the entrance, his presence undeniable yet subtle. Caelix Stroud walked with the ease of someone who was no stranger to attention, yet he avoided it deliberately. His eyes were sharp, yet unbothered. He scanned the environment around him, but he kept his focus ahead. There was an air of mystery surrounding him, a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the students around him. Unlike the usual flurry of excitement and noise that accompanied new faces, Caelix was different. He wasn't loud, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply existed. His composure, his lack of urgency, seemed almost out of place in a school that thrived on the constant buzz of popularity, status, and conflict. As Caelix passed by, students couldn't help but glance. Some studied him from the corners of their eyes, intrigued, but no one dared approach. They couldn't quite place what it was, but they knew one thing for sure: Caelix Stroud wasn't like the others. In the midst of the usual commotion, Ronan Westfield sat with his friends, his laughter booming as he recounted another one of his many conquests. The self-assured arrogance he wore like a crown had always earned him respect, or at least, that's what he thought. But as his gaze shifted across the crowded hallway, something caught his eye. A figure, walking with a quiet assurance that starkly contrasted with the noise around him. It was Caelix Stroud. Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly. The boy was tall, his features sharp, his movements controlled. And most striking of all, he exuded an effortless confidence, a calmness that unsettled Ronan. Here was someone who didn't care to be noticed, yet couldn't help but stand out. "What's up with that guy?" Ronan murmured, though more to himself than anyone else. His friends, ever loyal, shared knowing smirks, but Ronan's attention was now fully on Caelix. This kid. There was something about him, something that made Ronan's usual game of dominance seem trivial. The curiosity in Ronan's eyes was quickly replaced by something darker. If Caelix thought he could walk into the school and simply exist, without bending to the unspoken rules of the social hierarchy, Ronan was going to show him just how wrong he was. The next day, the hallways were filled with the usual noise as students scurried between classes. Ronan, with his usual swagger, moved through the crowd, a sly grin on his face as he glanced around for his next victim. But then, as if by design, Caelix Stroud appeared, walking through the hallway, as effortlessly cool and composed as always. It wasn't much, a simple bump, an accidental nudge as they passed in the narrow corridor, but Ronan's friends laughed loudly, as if the mere act of touching Caelix, however slight, was somehow a victory. They were waiting for a reaction. Anything that would prove Caelix wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. But Caelix didn't flinch. His eyes didn't even waver from their course. He simply continued walking, unfazed, his expression unreadable. The lack of reaction, the absolute indifference Caelix showed, gnawed at Ronan in a way he couldn't explain. This wasn't the typical scenario. When he did this to others, they would look back, sometimes angered, sometimes defensive, but always with a reaction. Caelix, however, acted as though nothing had happened. "Doesn't even care, huh?" Ronan muttered under his breath, a bitter taste of frustration filling his mouth. The laughter from his friends echoed around him, but the sound felt hollow now. The challenge had been issued, and Ronan couldn't help but feel that this would be different. Caelix Stroud wasn't like the others. Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that Caelix wasn't like the others. The way he moved through Stonebridge Academy, untouched by the usual pressures, was starting to irritate him more than he cared to admit. In the cafeteria, Ronan spotted Caelix sitting alone at a table near the window, eating his lunch in peace. It was too perfect an opportunity to pass up. As Ronan approached, his group followed behind, eagerly waiting for their leader to strike. With a swagger that came from years of dominating the school, Ronan leaned casually against the edge of Caelix's table, eyes glinting with challenge. "You really think you're too good for this place?" he said, his voice low but biting enough to draw the attention of the nearby students. "Or just too much of a coward to show your face around anyone?" Caelix didn't respond. His gaze never shifted from his food, but the silence between them felt loaded, heavy. There was no anger, no hesitation. Just a cool, almost unnerving indifference that seemed to mock Ronan's words. Ronan gritted his teeth. The silence from Caelix was louder than any insult. He was waiting for the usual defiance, the quick retorts, the fiery anger that followed in the wake of his barbed words. But instead, Caelix sat there, implacable, his face as unreadable as ever. This wasn't supposed to be like this. Ronan, despite himself, felt a prickle of unease. But he wouldn't let it show. The incident in the cafeteria didn't stay confined to the lunchroom. Whispers began to ripple through the hallways, spreading like wildfire among the students. Some spoke in awe, others in confusion, but the one thing they all shared was curiosity. The new kid, Caelix Stroud, was unlike anyone they had ever seen. His calmness, his unshakable composure in the face of Ronan's taunts, made him stand out even more. "Did you see how he didn't even flinch?" One girl whispered to her friend, her voice low but filled with intrigue. "Ronan's never had someone just ignore him like that." "I heard he doesn't talk much," another student remarked, watching Caelix pass by with an air of mystery surrounding him. "But there's something about him, like he's always in control." And so, as the days passed, the rumors about Caelix only grew. Some students admired him, some were fearful, and others simply couldn't figure him out. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that Caelix Stroud wasn't someone to be underestimated. Ronan was no fool. He knew that the only way to reassert his dominance was to break Caelix in front of everyone. He couldn't let Caelix remain a mystery, a figure too calm and controlled for anyone to understand. He had to break him. It was another lunch period. The cafeteria was alive with the usual buzz of students, but Ronan was no longer interested in just mocking Caelix from afar. He wanted to see him crack, wanted to see if there was any weakness hidden beneath that eerie calmness. As Caelix sat down with his tray, alone as always, Ronan strode over with his usual swagger, his friends in tow. He placed his hands firmly on Caelix's table, leaning in just close enough to let his words linger. "So, still think you're above it all? Still think you can just keep to yourself like nobody's gonna notice?" Ronan's voice was loud enough to carry, drawing the attention of the nearby students. His friends snickered, waiting for Caelix to react, expecting him to respond with anger, confusion, or at least frustration. But Caelix remained completely still, his eyes not leaving his food. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Ronan's face twisted into a grin. "Guess I was wrong," he said, his tone mocking. "You really don't have the guts, do you?" Still, Caelix didn't say a word. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to meet Ronan's taunts. His quiet defiance was more unsettling than Ronan could have imagined. The more Ronan tried, the more Caelix's silence began to chip away at his confidence. It was like trying to break stone with bare hands. Frustrating, painful, and pointless. Ronan's usual tricks were losing their effectiveness. The shoulder bumps, the sarcastic remarks, the passive-aggressive comments. They all bounced off Caelix, leaving Ronan feeling increasingly exposed. Every time he tried to provoke Caelix, every attempt to elicit a reaction, Caelix remained unfazed. There were no angry outbursts, no defensive retorts, not even a hint of fear, just the same unshakable composure. And it was starting to get to Ronan. He paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. What was Caelix hiding? Why wasn't he like the others? Why couldn't he break him? There had to be something. A way to crack through that cool exterior. There had to be something to make Caelix react. Something that would prove he wasn't untouchable. Ronan's frustration grew. The game wasn't going as planned. But one thing was certain. He couldn't let it end like this. Ronan's frustration had reached its peak. Despite all his efforts, Caelix refused to react. Every attempt to provoke him had failed, and the more Ronan thought about it, the more he became obsessed with the idea of breaking Caelix. It was no longer just about proving a point. It was about making Caelix understand that no one was above the social order at Stonebridge Academy. In the days that followed, Ronan found himself discussing Caelix with his closest friends, plotting ways to humiliate him, to knock him down from whatever pedestal he had seemingly put himself on. Maybe he's just waiting for the right moment to snap, Ronan mused, the idea of a final confrontation brewing in his mind. But if I get close enough, I can make him snap. I'll teach him a lesson that everyone will remember. His friends, once eager to join in on Ronan's schemes, began to hesitate, sensing that something deeper was brewing. They saw how Caelix's silence and strength had begun to shift the power dynamics, and Ronan's obsession with breaking him was starting to feel more dangerous than amusing. But Ronan, blind to their concerns, was resolute. It was time to show Caelix who really ruled the school. Alone in his room that evening, Caelix sat by his window, staring out into the quiet night. His thoughts were clear, unclouded. The days of school, the whispers, and the taunts were just part of his journey. He had learned long ago from his father, Caelix Stroud, that strength wasn't measured by how loudly one could shout or how hard one could hit. It was measured by how well you could control yourself in the face of provocation. Caelix had taught him the power of silence, the strength found in restraint, and the wisdom in choosing when to speak and when to act. Every moment of tension, every insult, every attempt to break him, Caelix saw them as tests that only strengthened his resolve. There would come a time he knew when he would have to act, but not yet, not until he was sure. The silence, for now, was his greatest weapon. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He would let his actions speak when the time was right. As Caelix's fingers traced the edges of his father's old journals, he understood that what was about to happen, what Ronan was planning, was inevitable. And when it came, Caelix would be ready. The next day in the cafeteria, the tension between Ronan and Caelix was palpable. Ronan had been building to this moment, and he saw it as the perfect opportunity to make his move. Caelix was sitting alone, as usual, eating his lunch in complete silence. Ronan, with his group of followers, walked over to the table, his smile wide with malicious intent. Without warning, Ronan slammed his hand down on Caelix's lunch tray, sending it flying off the table, the contents scattering across the floor. The cafeteria fell silent, all eyes turning to the scene. The once constant hum of conversation came to a standstill, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. The students around them waited for the reaction they had all been anticipating. Would Caelix lash out? Would he finally show fear or anger? Would he break? But Caelix didn't flinch. He didn't rise from his seat. He simply stared down at the mess, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he slowly stood up, placed his fork down carefully, and began to walk away. The cafeteria watched in stunned silence as Caelix calmly threw his tray in the trash. His movements deliberate and measured. Not a word was spoken. Ronan stood frozen, his grin faltering as he watched Caelix walk away. For the first time, Ronan's confidence wavered. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The humiliation he expected to see on Caelix's face wasn't there. Instead, Caelix had removed himself from the situation with the kind of calmness that made Ronan feel small in comparison. The lunch tray incident spread quickly. Students whispered about it for hours, murmuring in the hallways, sharing what they had seen. Some admired Caelix for his composure, for the way he had taken Ronan's attempt at humiliation in stride. Others, however, began to feel uneasy, sensing that something deeper was at play. "I've never seen anyone stay that calm," one student said, shaking their head. "Not even when someone flipped their lunch in their face." "I don't get it," another replied. "I would have lost it. But he just walked away like it didn't even matter." The whispers turned into more serious discussions as Caelix's silence continued to perplex and intrigue everyone. His refusal to engage, to rise to the bait, created a growing sense of mystery around him. To some, he became a symbol of unshakable strength. To others, he became an enigma, someone who was either incredibly brave or dangerously detached. But one thing was certain. The balance of power at Stonebridge Academy was starting to shift. Ronan, the one who had once commanded the hallways with fear and dominance, was now in a position he didn't understand. Caelix Stroud had made himself a target, but in doing so, He had become something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As Ronan walked the halls of Stonebridge Academy, the weight of what had just transpired in the cafeteria lingered heavily on his mind. His friends, once so eager to see Caelix break, now looked at him differently. They had expected fireworks, but instead, Caelix had walked away, untouched and unshaken. It gnawed at Ronan, the fact that he couldn't get under Caelix's skin. His usual tactics, shoulder bumps, sarcastic remarks, bullying in front of an audience had failed. And as the day went on, Ronan began to feel the growing realization that Caelix was different from everyone else he'd ever bullied. He had seen the fear in the eyes of his other targets. He had witnessed the anger, the frustration, the desperation, but Caelix's gaze was one of calm indifference. It was as if his words and actions didn't matter. The silence was killing Ronan, and the fact that he couldn't provoke a response left him with an unsettling feeling of loss of control. He had never met anyone who didn't care. The more Ronan thought about it, the more he felt something like fear stir inside him, something he had never felt before. He clenched his fists, trying to push the feeling away, but it was too late. Ronan knew the balance of power was shifting, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. Later that evening, after another tense day at school, Caelix found himself at home, sitting across from his father, Caelix Stroud. Caelix, ever composed, looked at his son with a quiet understanding. The two shared a deep connection, not only through blood but through unspoken knowledge. Caelix was a man who had seen the world in its darkest corners, a man who knew the value of silence and the weight of control. It was something Caelix had been taught his entire life. "Don't let them break you," Caelix said, his voice low and steady. "Not through words, not through their games. Silence is the loudest weapon, and when you use it, they won't know how to respond." Caelix listened, his face unreadable. He had already known that, of course. It was his foundation, the way his father had taught him to move through the world, unnoticed but always in control. "I don't want to fight, father," Caelix said quietly, "but I won't let them push me around." Caelix nodded, his gaze sharp but full of pride. "Good. Sometimes, to silence the noise around you, you have to be the calm in the storm. And when you speak, you do it in a way that shakes them to their core." Caelix's mind cleared. He had already made up his mind about what he would do. He didn't need to fight the way others fought. His power would be in his silence, and when it was time, he would act, not to hurt, but to end it. The following day, as Caelix moved through the school, he felt the weight of the eyes upon him. Whispers still followed him, but he was used to them now. What he didn't expect was the intensity that had started to grow behind those glances. It was as if the whole school was waiting for something to happen. And that something, Caelix realized, was Ronan. Ronan, whose usual bullying was beginning to feel like a desperate attempt to reclaim power, was circling like a predator. He had tried his subtle tactics, but now it was clear that he was planning something more direct. Caelix knew Ronan would come for him again. The bully wasn't the type to back down. But Caelix was ready. The pieces were falling into place, and he could almost hear the approaching storm. He had been preparing for this moment since the first time Ronan crossed him. He wouldn't let his silence be mistaken for weakness any longer. As Caelix walked to his next class, he could already sense the shift. Ronan was coming, and this time Caelix was no longer going to play by his rules. That afternoon, as the school day came to a close, Caelix stood by his locker, organizing his books for the evening. His movements were calm, deliberate, no rush. The hallway was quieter now, the chatter of the day dying down as students filed out for the day. But Caelix knew what was coming. He had known it all along. Ronan and his group of friends were going to confront him, this time for good, and he was prepared for it. There was no fear in Caelix's chest, no tightening of his muscles in anticipation. Instead, there was only a deep sense of resolve. He had been through far worse, and he understood better than anyone that sometimes the greatest power lay in standing still, in doing nothing at all. He remembered his father's words, "Don't start the fight, but be the one to end it." The minutes stretched out in the hallway as Caelix waited. He wasn't eager for what was coming, but he knew it was inevitable. His quiet strength was about to be tested once again, and this time it would not be enough to just walk away. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his thoughts. Ronan and his gang were close. Caelix turned slightly to face the door, his hand still gripping the edge of his locker. Everything had led to this moment. The tension in the air behind the gym was palpable. The usual calmness that Caelix carried with him throughout the school day had shifted. He stood in the dimly lit space, alone for the moment, but he knew they were coming. Ronan and his group appeared soon after, their figures casting long shadows in the fading daylight. Ronan's smirk was wide, his friends fanning out behind him like wolves in a pack. This time, there would be no subtlety, no quiet testing. It was going to be a full-on confrontation. Ronan stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with arrogance. "You thought you could walk through the school like nothing, huh? Like you're better than all of us?" His voice was loud, designed for the others to hear, to reinforce his control over the situation. Caelix didn't flinch. His eyes were calm, observing, as if he had been expecting this. Ronan's words bounced off him like water off stone. There was no anger in Caelix's expression, no irritation, just a quiet awareness of the storm brewing around him. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Caelix said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. Ronan sneered. "Well, that's the problem, isn't it? You think you're better than everyone, but you're not. You're just some quiet freak with no friends. You don't belong here." Still, Caelix said nothing. He let the words hang in the air, watching Ronan's growing frustration. The bully was used to dominating through insults, but Caelix's silence was an impenetrable wall. The calmness was unnerving to Ronan. The group behind Ronan began to shift uneasily. They were waiting for something, anything, to happen. But it wasn't Caelix who would make the first move. Ronan's patience finally cracked. He stormed forward, his hand rising in an aggressive, almost instinctual movement, and in that instant, Caelix moved. Ronan was close, too close. In one fluid motion, Caelix slapped him hard across the face. The sound was sharp, loud, echoing in the stillness. For a moment, everything stopped. The group behind Ronan went silent, their eyes wide, unsure of what to do next. Ronan stumbled back, his hand instinctively going to his cheek, but the sting was nothing compared to the shock that raced through him. His face burned with humiliation as he tried to regain his composure, his mouth working but no words coming out. Caelix stood there, his posture relaxed, but the quiet strength in his eyes was unmistakable. He spoke in a low, deliberate tone, the words cutting through the stunned silence. "Don't mistake my silence for weakness." Ronan's chest heaved with rage, but he couldn't bring himself to react. The slap had taken away his sense of control, his confidence. His pride, so carefully built on bullying others, had been shattered in an instant. Caelix turned to walk away, his calmness leaving Ronan in stunned silence, unable to follow, unable to do anything. As Caelix left the small crowd behind, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already made his point. His silence had said more than any words could ever achieve. The students who had been watching, once whispering about Caelix's strange composure, now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Some whispered in admiration. Others felt a creeping unease, unsure of the power that Caelix had just demonstrated. Ronan, on the other hand, stood frozen, his pride and arrogance completely crumbled. The slap, the defiance, it had all come too suddenly, too overwhelmingly. In front of everyone, he had been reduced to nothing. The words Caelix had spoken echoed in his mind. He had been silenced, and for the first time, Ronan knew it wasn't just about physical dominance. It was about something deeper, something that Caelix had shown with a single act of defiance, control. The thought haunted him as he slowly turned and walked away, his steps uncertain, the weight of Caelix's presence pressing down on him. That evening, as Ronan sat in his room, he replayed the scene in his mind over and over again. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that Caelix would break. But he didn't. Caelix had stood there, silent until the slap, and then walked away, completely in control. Ronan's hands clenched into fists, but they didn't feel as strong as they used to. He could still feel the sting on his cheek, but what hurt more was the vulnerability he had never felt before. The power he had built up, the reputation he had so carefully curated, had been destroyed in one moment of silence. It wasn't just the slap. It was everything that came after. The way Caelix had handled the situation. Calm, collected, and utterly unshaken. For the first time in his life, Ronan was forced to face the fact that he wasn't invincible. His pride had been shattered, and with it, the fear he instilled in others was gone. Ronan lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. One thing was certain: this wasn't over. The game had changed, and for the first time he didn't know how to win. The next day, Stonebridge Academy buzzed with whispers. Caelix Stroud had done what no one had expected. He had stood up to Ronan Westfield, and not with fists or words, but with a quiet, undeniable strength. The slap had left a mark far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Students who had once looked at Caelix with indifference now regarded him with curiosity, and something more. Some admired him, some feared him. The power dynamic within the school had shifted. Where Ronan once reigned supreme, now Caelix's calm composure and impenetrable silence had taken its place. Caelix was untouchable. His presence was no longer invisible. In the crowded hallways, eyes followed him, but he didn't flinch. He walked through the halls as he always had, but now, every step felt heavier, charged with the silent weight of the power he had acquired without lifting a finger. The respect, or perhaps the fear, that had been slowly building for days now settled into something undeniable. Caelix Stroud was not someone to be messed with. Ronan felt the walls closing in around him. The students who once followed him without question now kept their distance. His friends, the ones who had stood by him in every cruel joke, every sneering taunt, now seemed uncomfortable in his presence. There was no longer that sense of unquestionable power, that aura of invincibility he had once carried so easily. At lunch, his usual table was quiet. His so-called friends barely glanced at him, their once supportive laughter now replaced by awkward silence. No one dared to sit near him. The whispers, once admiration or fear of his dominance, now whispered of his defeat at the hands of Caelix Stroud. Ronan tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling, but it gnawed at him. The pride that had once come so naturally, so effortlessly, now felt fragile, hanging by a thread. He no longer knew who he was without that sense of control, and it terrified him. Every glance, every whisper seemed to carry with it the same message. Ronan's time was up. That evening, Caelix sat in his room, the events of the day settling into his mind. He had won, but in a way that left him with more questions than answers. He knew he didn't need to fight, didn't need to prove anything. His father's lessons echoed in his thoughts. Alistair Stroud had always taught him the same thing. Power isn't about violence, it's about control. And control comes not from forcing others into submission but from knowing when to act, when to remain silent, and when to step back. Caelix had learned that lesson well. His composure, his silence, had been his weapon, and it had been more than enough. But his father had also warned him that such power comes with a price. People don't forget who you are when you're untouchable, and they don't forgive easily. The respect Caelix had gained would bring new challenges. His father's legacy was a double-edged sword, one that Caelix now held firmly in his grasp. As the night wore on, Caelix reflected on the path ahead. He knew Ronan wouldn't back down easily. This fight wasn't over. But Caelix also knew that he wouldn't need to lift a finger to win. He already had what was most important: control, and that would carry him through whatever came next. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Everywhere he went, he could feel eyes on him. Students who once avoided Caelix now watched Ronan with growing suspicion. The whispers followed him, a constant reminder of his failure to dominate. It was as if the weight of every eye, every glance, was an unspoken judgment on his shattered pride. At school, he began to notice subtle changes. The once confident swagger he'd carried through the hallways now felt forced. His interactions with others, even his friends, became strained. He'd catch someone glancing at him, and for a split second he would freeze, unsure of what they were thinking. The realization slowly crept in. He no longer controlled the atmosphere. He was no longer the king of the school. The realization made him uneasy, as if the world he had built was starting to crumble. It was a creeping fear, one that gnawed at him from the inside, and the more he tried to push it down, the more it grew. Something had changed. Something inside him was breaking. And the worst part? He couldn't figure out how to fix it. Ronan received a message one morning, just as the school day began. It was short, simple, and haunting in its subtlety. The message read, "Tell your dad to watch out for his work. Accidents can happen." The words hit Ronan like a punch to the gut. His fingers shook as he read them over and over, trying to convince himself it was a prank or an empty threat. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't some high school joke. This was real. His thoughts immediately turned to Caelix, to the silent warning that had been delivered to him through Caelix's calm demeanor. Caelix hadn't acted out of aggression. He hadn't threatened Ronan directly. But the message was crystal clear. The control was gone, and Ronan had stepped into a world far deeper than he could have imagined. For the first time, Ronan felt the full weight of his actions. He had crossed a line, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. Slowly, steadily, but undeniably. By the end of the week, Stonebridge Academy was a different place. The shift had been subtle at first, but now it was undeniable. Caelix Stroud, once just the quiet, composed new kid, had become a figure of legend. His calmness in the face of Ronan's aggression, the slap that had ended the bullying, had shifted the power dynamics of the entire school. No one dared to challenge him anymore. No one dared to look at him the same way. Ronan Westfield, on the other hand, was a shadow of the person he once was. His confidence, once built on dominance and fear, had been shattered. The rumors about his sudden loss of control were spreading faster than the ones about Caelix. And the worst part? Ronan didn't know how to stop it. The students who once feared him now avoided him. His social circle had splintered. His friends distanced themselves, sensing the vulnerability he was trying so desperately to hide. As for Caelix, he remained as calm and composed as ever. He didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to take joy in the downfall of others. The silent power he had cultivated, the strength to walk through life without needing to fight, had become his greatest weapon. And now he stood unchallenged at the top, not through violence, but through sheer control of himself and his environment. The power at Stonebridge had shifted, no longer dictated by fear or force, but by silent strength. Caelix Stroud had proven that the quietest force could hold the greatest sway. For more chilling true time crime stories, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like and share.